Hello everyone, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to continue to discuss about the chapter 8 materials. So in the previous videos, we already talked about the employment topics, and today we're going to specifically talk about the inflation topics. Well, in the previous chapter, we already talked about how we calculate price level changes in the economy. And we haven't really talked about why we care, right? And why is it such an important topic in the study of macroeconomics? So we'll dive into it today and try to understand why people care so much about inflations. Well, first of all, if we think about the US, in the US, we have the central bank, the Federal Reserve Office, that actually overlooking several macroeconomic variables like the GDP, employment, and also inflations. Well, when we talk about monetary policy in general, there are two groups of people in the Federal Reserve Office that doesn't seem they will be looking at the economy in the same perspective. So there's a group that we call them the hawks. So the hawks are basically where the groups of the officials care more about the inflation changes. So they want to target the inflations more to make it to make sure that the price level are stable over time. However, on the other hand, there is another group called, we usually call them the doves, and they basically taking the perspective of the economy and making more focuses on targeting unemployment. So that means they want to actually stabilize job security or employment in general instead of the inflations. Well, then of course you might want to ask the questions. Hey, how come we don't target both, right? Why don't we just make both of them actually consistent, stabilize it over time in the whole economy setup? Well, unfortunately, the unemployment and inflation, they are usually what we call the two great evils of macroeconomics. So that means, well, they are the two principal goals. Unfortunately, we cannot actually manage or to take control at the same time. So there's always a nature of the trade-off between unemployment and also inflations. Well, we probably don't see it right now, but in the later chapters, we are going to start using macroeconomic model to explain why there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflations so that we can have a better understanding. But for now, it's a good concept to keep in mind that any macroeconomic policy, unfortunately, for now, cannot be easily controlled the unemployment and inflation at the same time. So usually we have to give up one to basically have the result of the others. Well, a quick review, right, of what we call inflations. So inflation is basically a overall price level adjustments over time, and how we calculate the inflation rates in the economy, or talking about the changes of the overall price level, we will use price index, like for example, the CPI or maybe the GDP deflator, to take the percentage change of that index period by period. Sometimes it could be annual inflation rate, or maybe it could be a quarterly inflation rate, depends on how we define the periods. So when the inflation rates increase or is a positive number, that means well the overall price levels are increasing period by period. On the other hand, if the inflation rate is negative, then well we are seeing price level going down. Now let's think about why people care about inflations, right? And how it associates with what we think about the macroeconomy operation as a whole. So think about this very simple economy case where we have the firms and workers in the economy. And the general intuition here is when the economy contains these two agencies and they are interacting with each other, the balance of this amounts of money um, has to be matched. So when the workers working for the firms, they are making, let's say, $300 values of the cars, right? So each car costs $100, and there are three cars to purchase, and the total sum of the value of the cars in the economy will be add up to $300. So that means, well, in order for the firms to pay or for the firms to sell all the cars in the economy, they have to first ensure that everyone in the economy will have add up to total of $100 per car, that values of money. So that means, well, they have to ensure that every single person add up their total amounts of income will have total of $300 uh, values in order to buy up all the cars, right, in the economy. So therefore, you can think about the simple case where the firms will pay wages to all the households in the economy, and to make sure that everyone can buy all the car, they will have to make sure to pay total of at least $300 wages to everyone's in the economy, right? Not every single person, but in the sum of the amounts of dollars to every household. Well, how does it change when we say the firm marked up the car to $30,000 total, right? So each car now costs $10,000 to buy. Well, if we keep the wages the same level as before, then obviously everyone will have some amounts of money that they earn from the firm, but they only add up to the total amounts to $300. So can all the households buy the total value of $30,000 of cars in the economy in those sense? Well, obviously not. Right? So the firms will not be able to sell any cars in the economy because no one has that much of a money to buy even a single car. And as a result, the firm will have to say, well, we have to pay wages higher because we're generating the workers are generating car values that it's much higher. So I can sell it in the market at a higher price. So therefore, I'm willing to pay higher wages to the economy for people to make the car. And then the people will receive the wages from the firm that has enough money so that they can buy the car at a higher price level. So you can see these intuitions actually apply to any forms of economy, right? So the overall price levels here, which is the total amounts of dollars for the cars, basically it's a price level in the economy, right? So even though it goes up 100% or maybe 100 times, the wages still adjust, right, in order to make the balance of the two. So inflation is a concept that it's not only just explaining why the price level increase or decrease is important, but it also tells us how affordable the goods are for the general economy, right, for all the households in the economy. And also it gives us an idea of when the adjustments of wages or incomes should be made. Well, when we talk about prices, or maybe in the previous topic of GDP, we know that we cannot compare these values directly from time to time. And the fact is that when the overall price level changes, right, the GDP values will change, right? So therefore, we have to do some inflation adjustments to GDP in order to directly compare the level of outputs from time to time. Well, this concept it's also true applying to almost everything that we track in the economy, right? So any macroeconomic variables that we talk about here also has the difference between the real terms and the nominal terms. So the real terms, it's basically the inflations or price level adjusted values, where the nominal terms the nominal terms is the values without adjusting for any price level changes. So you can think about the concept of real GDP versus nominal GDP that we discussed in the previous chapter. But when you talk about your wages, you can also think about wages in terms of the real and also the nominals, your income also as well, and also as well as the interest rates. Right? So there's a real interest rate and nominal interest rate depends on the price level adjusted. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about the interest rate later, but for now, just keep a concept that the real terms and the nominal terms always exist, and you're always trying to compare the values in different time periods using the real term instead of the nominal terms. Let's take a very simple example here, how value adjusts to inflation. So we can actually take this example using the CPI index and think about how an annual salary of $30,000 in 2000, the year of 2000s, compared to the same person, same jobs, 15 years later, and now the wages or the salary has gone up to $50,000 in 2015, right? And consider the CPI during that period from 2000 to 2015 goes from 174 to 237. Again, if you forget about how to interpret this number, the index number is not a number that tells you about the price level itself, but it's a relative index compared to the base year where we calculate the price level index. And in this case, well, does Winston actually has a higher income comparing to his 2000 wages? Well, is $50,000 greater than $30,000? Well, in terms of the nominal terms, obviously yes, right? But in terms of the real terms, we don't know. We're not sure yet. We have to actually adjust for inflations in order to compare the two numbers across time. So how can we do that? So the concept here is fairly intuitive. You can either do one way or the other. So the first way is basically pushing the price level or the wages that earn in 2000 to the value in 2015 so that we can compare directly. Or the reverse way is to basically bring the $50,000 values in 2015 back in the time in 2000s so that we can compare the two numbers directly. So either one way or the other works. So let's show you an example how we are going to do that here. So we're going to bring the 2015 values back into the time. Right? So in order to do that, the way how we do it is simple. So we are using actually we're bringing the price we're bringing the wages forward, right, to 2015 level. So we are using the 2000 wage, the $30,000 times the CPI in 2015, and then divided by the CPI in 2000, the year of 2000s. So to put it into the number, so we have $30,000 times 237 divided by 174. And this number here, $40,862 approximately, is the number that we can directly compare to the amounts Winston earned in the year of 2015. So that means, well, in 2015, Winston earned $50,000 value to use to spend on goods and services. To buy the same amount of goods and services in 2000s, right, it will basically, the $50,000 value of goods and services, right, it will cost $40,000 or it will be, so Winston will have a wage of $40,862 worth of goods and services to be paid in 2000. So Winston can buy $50,000 worth of goods versus if he is using the 2000 wages and bring it forward to 2015, he can only afford to buy $40,862 worth of values of goods and services. So to make a direct comparison here, obviously Winston is making more money in 2015 in terms of the price adjusted real wages. So when we talk about inflations, right? So we also seeing some um, aspect of it from the previous slides. We also want to understand a little bit more in depth of what are the causes, right? So involved with inflations, particularly in the past few years where we have seen a very long high inflation uh, periods, um, and people realize how important it is to face these high inflation causes. So the first thing that we, of course, seeing when the economy is running with high inflations is the overall price level actually increase, right? So it makes things more expensive and less affordable to buy. However, in the previous slides, we also know that there is intuitions behind when firms and businesses rising the prices and they don't see their goods and services are selling in the economy. They have to also make adjustment to the wages of the people. So it's not like this is a permanent cost, but unfortunately, wages are usually adjusting slower than the prices in the economy. So therefore, there will be a lack of these adjustments. So people might suffer this unaffordable, expensive goods and services in the short term. But in the long run, right, we are expecting changes to the wages will comes and people will seeing the wages to go up to catch up with the inflations, right? However, the wages adjusting is a true story, but how it adjusts to everyone's, it's a different story, right? So this wage or income adjustments may not equally distributed to everyone's, right? So you can think about easily. Some people who might get a 5% increase in wages because, well, their management's actually seeing a 5% increase in inflation and they are willing to adjust by that amount. Versus there might be company who are only adjusting by 2%, even with the same amounts of inflations, right, in place. So these adjustments are not very equally or very normally distributed to the overall populations. So therefore, it makes people who has less adjustments from their company to suffer more with these inflations, right? And it also affect them in the longer term as well. So except for the costs imposed by the uneven wages or income adjustments, there's also another social cost that could imposed by the inflations, particularly when the inflation is kind of a known factor in the economy, and we call this anticipated inflations. When people can see inflation is coming or maybe coming in the near future, some people will make adjustments of the behavior, how they are allocating their assets, or maybe how to make changes during those inflation periods. So for the first one, we call this a shoes leather cost. So it's when people holding their paper forms of money or physical forms of currency, they tend to think that their purchasing power will decrease when inflation comes, and therefore they are going to be rushed into the asset markets, trying to save their money into high return assets so that their money will not be depreciate with the inflation costs imposed. So they will be spending times and money, right, and to find resources in order to save the money that can ensure their value. It's not going to be depreciated too much. Well, another cost is called the manual cost. It's when the firms and businesses they are trying to adjust their menus, right, more frequently than the stable price periods. So when prices change in the economy very frequently, then obviously this kind of manual cost will be imposing to the firms and businesses. Well, the last one here is called a unit of account cost. It's when inflation or extreme inflation situations making money to be not reliable to use for transactions. And people will shift to other forms of currency or other forms of money in order to make transactions with it. So in the recent years, obviously you might notice that people are using more digital currency to make transactions to purchase different things comparing to the past. Well, not saying that it's a major trend, but there's an options, right? So in some countries like Venezuela, where inflation has been very, very high in the past 10, 15 years, like decades, people tend to lose confidence on their local currency. And what people do in Venezuela is they are shifting to using US dollar to make transactions of goods and services instead of the local money. So that also impose a social cost for people switching to different forms of money to make transaction in the local domestic economy. Well, obviously, when anticipated inflations impose the social cost, what's even worse is the unanticipated inflations, right? So when inflation comes all of the sudden, when people does not have a preparation for it. So in those cases, the unanticipated inflation is going to affect the longer terms commitments and contracts much more compared to the day-to-day behavior adjustments. So for example, wage contracts, when you sign a contract that actually guarantee to pay you whatever amount or maybe to cap you to certain percentage change year over year. Mortgage loans is another commitment, right, for a very long term when you're buying a house. So those are the interest rates that is basically committed for a very long term, or wages that you promised or the employers promise the employees for a very long commitment. In those cases, unfortunately, when price level adjusted, then some people in the contract has to be taking the loss, particularly in the loan markets where the borrower and lenders will have a significant favorite or maybe disadvantage during the high inflations or maybe high deflations periods. So during the high inflation periods, the lender who lend the money for long term usually will lose values of their investments in the long run. And the reason being is, well, if they committed to lend the money to a borrower for 2% every year, and unfortunately, the inflation rates actually going up to 10% or maybe even 20% to the extreme case, the money with the 2% increase to pay back to the lender can only worth 10 or 20% less comparing to the previous period. Well, in this case, well, obviously the lender will be taking a loss when the high inflation comes into place. On the other hand, the deflations, which is the decrease in price level, will hurt the borrower because, well, the cost for the debtor it's heavier. So lender will actually find that the payments coming from the borrowers to worth more when the money returned to their hands. Well, just when people thinking about inflation is not a good thing to happen in the economy, particularly at a very fast-paced inflation uh, periods, just like the previous 2, 3 years. Um, but most people think that okay, inflation will make everything more expensive and less affordable, and imposing all these social costs. Um, Unfortunately, or fortunately, inflation is not the worst thing to happen. The even worse things to happen in the economy is when the economy get going into a deflation periods, where the overall prices actually drops. So when the overall price level drop, of course, people might think that, oh, it's going to be less expensive to buy goods and services, which is somehow true in the short term, but the falling expected price actually makes consumer spending much slower. That means, well, they are waiting for the price to go even lower and holding up their money and putting them into maybe longer term saving so that they're not spending in the economy. So reducing the consumption in the economy will have a very bad or big negative impact to the overall economic transactions or activities levels. It also increased the burden of the borrower, like we talked about previously, where the borrower is going to have a much more to pay from the money. So you can easily think about this problem using the nominal interest rates comparing to inflations from time to time, right? So when the borrower trying to think about the actual real interest rate to pay for the mortgages or loan, when inflation is going into negative, right? So deflation happens, it actually increases the real interest rates that they pay for their loan or mortgages. So nominal interest rates versus real interest rate, again, it's a very important topic in the study of macroeconomics because, well, it actually tells us about the true cost for borrowing and the true cost, the true returns of lending money. The general idea here is not as complicated. So the general idea here about real interest rate is using the nominal interest rates minus the inflation rates. Right? So suppose you buy a cheeseburger at a price of $5 in 2014, but instead spending your money on a total of $100 in 2014, you choose to lend it, right, to someone for 1 year and gaining the interest of 10% the year after. So 1 year later, you receive $110, but the price of the cheeseburger actually went up from $5 to $10. So in this example here, you can simply think about the nominal interest rate is basically the 10% you gain from lending out the money, but the inflation rate in this case is going from $5 to $10, which is 100% gain from 1 year to another year. So in this case, obviously, the purchasing power of that $100 that you lent in 2014 and get back in 2015 actually decrease in value, right? So this also gives you an idea why studying the real interest rate is so important. Here's an example of the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate movements in the United States across time. Most of the time, they are moving fairly close to each other. There are some time where the real interest rate might hitting the zero number or below. It's basically when we say the real interest rate is going into the negative level. So it's not true that we can set the nominal interest rate to be below zero, but it could be true when the inflation rate is so high or the inflation rate is so low or the deflation is so high that drives the real interest rate to be lower or higher, right? So just to sum it up, nominal interest rate is approximated as the interest rates on the 3 months US Treasury bill. Inflation rate is measured by the changes in the CPI. The real interest rate equals to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. So the real interest rates provide a better measure for firms and businesses to make the decisions whether to borrow the fund to buy investment goods or expanding their businesses or buying new machineries, and it imposes a true cost for borrowing money in the economy. So when deflation actually occurs, then we will see the nominal interest rate to be less than the real interest rates. So in this chapter, we cover a lot of different topics, right? So going from employment to inflations, we talk about also the cost of the unemployment and also the cost of the inflations or deflations. So this will give us a very general idea of how important it is to measure this economic variables so that we can talk about the overall performance of the economy and what are the things that we have to look up when the economy is moving from one direction to another direction. Well, this is a long chapter, and hopefully you will spend some time to read about the book and to get more details about each of these topics. Well, thank you for watching for this in this videos, and hopefully you will find some interesting topics from it. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.